I know last time we were talking about a whole array of topics, and then you had actually met Dr. Umar. That was tough.
Yeah, I had a great conversation with Dr. Umar. He actually came down over to town, and he had an event going on. First, it was a council of the elders. He spoke with some elders in the community and talked about just maintaining the main focus. I believe it was about maintaining the black family and how they were going to achieve that. And yeah, they focused on that. And then later, Dr. Umar had a speech of his own. And then later, there was time to meet and greet. And he was actually very open with everyone. This isn't some sort of internet gimmick that he's doing. He's really out there. You know, really stands with what he believes.
Yes, sir.
And yeah, he was actually just a very open person. I just stayed after, just got to chop it up with him for a pretty long time. Got to chop it up with a few other people there. Just it was a good event in general, and we talked a lot about a array of different things.
Real quick, how do you think Dr. Umar's ideas align with historical figures such as Malcolm X, who say like segregation is the key to black success? Like what, and also like what else did you learn from Dr. Umar in terms of like, talking with him one to one? I know you had spent like great a big deal, actually being able to conversate with him.
Well, yeah, I think a key point that Dr. Umar touched on was kind of the illusion of black power that we have in a society. So many times people, you know, give a black person, whether it's an athlete, a musician, a content creator, even they give them a brand deal, and they give them a stake in a company, and then they want to act like, oh, this is black business. But really, the power just stays in this same hands as it's been before. They just give them a little bigger piece of the pie. It's not really recirculating throughout the community.
Yeah.
And I think a good point that he made is that we need to redefine what the term black business really means. That a black business is not simply a business owned by black people. It's a business that serves the black community. So they employ black people. They are in the
Mhm.
community. They lead efforts in the community. They give back to it as well. And they just show a force to progress it, you know. But that was a strong idea. I think it really um mimics many activists such as you said, Malcolm X, W.E.B. Du Bois, Angela Davis. They've talked about similar things like that. Even Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Um, I believe it was him or somebody else that maybe someone in the Black Panther Party that said, um, you can't fight um, white capitalism with black capitalism. You know, you have to employ a different system. Because if we keep the same hierarchy that's kept people like in the bottom, you know, and just reapply it to an adjacent community, how do you think that's going to work out? And that's maybe a little bit of possibly like where my questions start with Dr. Umar's movement. I asked them, how do you regain the trust of many black individuals? Because a lot of the times, um, the black community resided in the church. The church would go and they would have schools run by the black churches. Um, they would feed the poor, the sick, the elderly in the black churches. They would give education in the black churches and all these resources, hospitals, police forces in the black churches. But then with the Bush administration, the federal government actually started funding these black churches. And as these funds came in, they started dialing back, on their support of their community. You can look
Yeah.
this up too. We
I
spent
mean,
and talked about this.
I also think that goes in the point that like the black community as a whole, and also goes like, you know, a greater observance of actual like self identity, but like the black community as a whole has to stop relying on, outsourcing that their their acceptance to other people. A lot of there's a lot of communities, such as BLM, that are, demanding, like anti-racism and demanding like equal rights and just to feel heard and seen. But I really don't think that you need to be outsourcing this to a whole nother community, and it really starts from within.
Mhm, of course. But really, where it starts is just a trust in our own community, because we have so many black elders, and I've experienced this too, that many times they think that they're better than their fellow black people, even though they were just a little bit more fortunate,
Yeah.
just the circumstances, that's how it played out. So to look like that, and then they try to get other black people who they see as beneath them to try and listen to them. They put themselves as holier than thou. And then nobody wants to listen to that because nobody wants to get talked below. They want to be talked that level. They want to have their perspectives recognized. They don't want to be talked that, they want to be talked with, you
Yeah.
know? So I think that's where my disconnect with uh Dr. Umar starts to begin, you know, just respectfully. Um be- because he was selling his book at the event uh, for $50.
Damn.
Me personally, um, I believe $50 is kind of steep because many times the people who need to read it most uh, won't be able to afford it,
Yeah.
you know, and that's where it starts. So, but we talked about this a little, and we need to really rebuild the trust in ourselves. That comes from an individual aspect, but also as a community aspect. We need to people just need to gather themselves in together and see, okay, what can we do? What We don't need to depend on anybody else, like you said. We don't need to outsource to the federal government, to our state or municipal governments. How can we start our task force by ourselves and make a concrete plan to rise up? But
Yeah.
yeah,
No, of course. And then we had also gotten a lot of questions from our last podcast. People were asking
definitely.
us, how can you tell if you're chopped, right? And I think the underlying answer to that is, you gotta like look inwards, right? Um, if you're familiar with Roald Dahl, he says, as someone, you can be born with a big nose or whatever features that you may dislike, but you can see people like this and they're still like perceived as beautiful, but as the soul starts to rot and continue to dull its glow, you can see that the face starts taking on uglier expressions and stuff that's really uncharacteristic of someone who's pure hearted. So I'd advise the viewers, look at yourself in the mirror and say, are you satisfied with what you see? Not even on a physical level, but a spiritual level, and understand that if you're not, that there's a lot of development there that has to be done, and you're not satisfied for a reason. So
Yeah. You know, Many people were asking just off the other podcast. You told me you were looking at this. Oh yeah, people are asking how to tell if I'm chopped. Am I chopped? Am I cooked? Well, I feel like just the answer is very simple. You know, um, I mean, you can figure it out. You can like comment below, send us a picture of yourself. We'll tell you if you're chopped or not. We're honest people over here. But like you said, it's more from within. We've all seen people that you can have two people that look the exact same, physically, but just the way they carry themselves, one person carries themselves saying, okay, yeah, this is who I am, this is me, this is my essence, and um just presenting themselves in the best way possible. And then you have another person that's coming in and you can just tell that they don't like themselves, and if you don't like yourself, who's going to like you? But I feel like we've all experienced people that you can just
yeah.
see them and you can just tell.
And I
Like,
also think it's a broader like characterization. Like, if you're the type of person to ask, online and ask random people online, am I chopped? you're really setting in stone, in even in your unconscious mind, the fact that you are tribe, because someone who isn't going to be asking these questions constantly. They're going to be focusing on stuff that actually matters. You can't control what you can't fix what you can't control, but you can totally amplify what you can. And a lot of people just are wasting time online, asking these questions, and they're obsessed with this, but really don't understand the broader power of self identity. I take it as
Or
so far as like I have this self identity. Let's say like I don't even feel like, let's say I'm in a bad mood or I don't feel confident that day. I'm not even gonna go out because I don't want to have negative experiences that would characterize myself as somebody in that negative state of mind. So that's why I also reserve many activities that I like partake in, like have a choice in, to when I'm really at my highest level of peak confidence, because all these little things add up, and they get built in your subconscious, and you really have to be careful of how you're like talking to yourself, and your external triggers that are going to end up amplifying your self identity, whether it's in a negative way or a positive way.
yeah, of course, and many people, they're so fixated on their appearance. They want everything to be perfect. You got social media filters, all that. We got people nowadays, they're talking about, cancel tilt and like jaw lines and stuff.
Yeah,
They're measuring out, like, you seen that? They like measure out the angles, and then
yeah, they're
you get put in it or something.
yeah, and the funny thing
But
is,
yeah, but I feel like what people fail to understand, is that if you look at all the people that are deemed attractive in real life, they all have distinctive features. In our societies,
mm,
it might not necessarily be, oh, this is what you should have, this is what this is what is optimal, but it's distinctive. It's what makes them them, and that's their trademark. That's their branding,
yeah, and you
and
can
when
really
you
use these features like, as if you're insecure about something, why don't you actually just use it to scale your brand and scale your image? Like you can use that to your advantage. I've seen people who have features that they dislike, and they're just gonna wallow in that, really just that self-pity, right? But if you're able to take these features and make a self identity out of them, you're gonna, I've seen that happen, even people day to day, and people don't look twice, right? So I also think like another thing that social media construes is, let's say you take someone and you're rating his looks, right, on scale, whatever. There's two different type of people. You can look at someone on a camera and rate them on a looks wise, but there's a certain type of people that when you see them in person, you're gonna be like, you're gonna be either disappointed or um really just surprised at the way that their aura, it really exemplifies who they are. Let's say you think this person online is such a cool guy, but you meet them in person, they're fairly short. They don't really have a good frame, and they don't really carry themselves in a room. Their level of attractiveness is gonna go down a lot, right? But when you look at someone, Marlon, for example, he's very good looking, but even so, you can see in his interactions with people online, they get amplified because of the way he carries himself, his height, and all the effort he's put into building that physique of his. So these are a lot of things that you have to take in consideration, and also have to understand, people are only posting the best versions of themselves on social media. You don't see someone, when they wake up, right, and they're all bloated and tired. Like, you don't see that version on social media. You see the best angle, right?
Of course, yeah, and people need to take that in consideration when they look at themselves, because what jealousy, like you said before, what jealousy does, when people go and look at these people like Marlon or who else, like I don't really know these people, like,
I think
um,
Marlon's like really the only example of like someone, because a lot of these TikTokers I see, they have a good following and ratio of women interested in them, but in person, their game is severely off, and they don't have that like aura about them. Even like on IRL streams, like and in person, like you can, if you have that sense, you can just tell.
yeah. But it's just like people always be saying like people like Marlon, Micah P, like they need to be stopped, you know.
Yeah.
But why don't you just go ahead and look introspectively, you know, because who needs to stop them, you know? What are you saying like, oh, like they need to be stopped? Like you're just fixated so much on them and that depletes your energy, that depletes from yourself. And you know, people can tell when you're fixated on yourself, like overly fixated on yourself, overly fixated on others. And then there's the people who just walk through life with goals and stuff. Okay, I need to be here, I need to do this. And people, when you see a goal oriented person in real life, people like to be around that because frankly, it rubs off. If you go with a person that's determined, disciplined, and dedicated, people like to be around that person because subconsciously they think, oh, I'm lacking in these areas, but maybe if I hang around this person, then hopefully I will be more like them. I
Yeah,
will.
and it
Um,
frankly,
grow up.
it magnetizes these people towards you, and a lot of people are looking in terms of attraction. They see what someone they see a feature that they don't have, and if they see that feature in someone else, that's just gonna amplify the level of attraction they have towards you, or just the ability for them to follow you as a leader.
Mhm. Yeah, you know. So obviously, it's not to say that you know you shouldn't take care of yourself. You know, obviously, we're not telling you to just go out of bed and not shower for a week and then just go like, oh well, I'm being me, I'm confident. You know, that's not what confidence is. You know, that's just being lazy at that point.
Yeah,
But you know, take care of yourself. You know, and be focused on what you need to do. You know, and then everything else, the people will follow you because they just see someone who is worth being followed. You know, you exactly that. You want to be worth being followed.
yeah,
If you look at yourself introspectively and see, like, okay, if I was Joe Schmo, would I look at that person and be like, oh yeah, that's that nigga. Like that's a cool nigga. Just be honest. A lot of y'all people in the comments commenting, "Am I chopped? Am I cooked?" Y'all answer it for yourselves. You know, no, no one will want to follow your dumb ass. But if you look at yourself and be like, yeah, I'm on the right path. I might have not made it yet, but I'm on the way to it. And have trust in myself. I have trust in what I need to do. I built a routine. I'm disciplined. I have good habits. You know, I got people around me that care about me. I have a good friend circle that I can depend on. Then yeah, you know, people will probably want to follow you and you'll be able to see that. Not get caught up on it, not make that your identity, but you'll just be able to observe that and maybe use it to your advantage.
yeah. I mean, you got to look like. I feel like once you reach a certain level of introspection, and you know you're on this path of your self identity, you just have people who naturally follow you. See, like me, I have people who naturally follow me and ask me questions, and really treat my word as law. When I'm just another person, except I have like this delusion that I can be greater, and thus I am being greater. And I also, not even like, I'm gonna add on to, like, let's say like I'm not there yet. I think even if you have the level of certainty that not even I'm not there yet, that you are there yet, that's gonna shape your reality even further. And these people are just gonna naturally, you're gonna be a natural leader, right? And yeah, I've noticed a lot of traits. I've exemplified like confidence. In social settings, people are a lot very introverted. Tend to follow me because I've been there. I've been an introvert, and I still am. You can't really change that, but you can adapt to your social settings, right? And you can, most importantly, get out of your comfort level. And I think getting out of your level of comfort is the number one key to success because it involves change.
And yeah, of course you're right. Like if you want to go somewhere in life, if you're trying to get to a goal, you need to view yourself as you already achieved it. You know, you need to make that who you are. If you're trying to make the NBA, don't say, "Oh, I'm trying to make the NBA." Say, I'm an NBA player, and then go about your day as if you were
Yeah.
an NBA player. Like go to your workouts, do ball handling, shooting, all stuff like that. Do your recovery, do your strength and conditioning, carry yourself when you go and play your games on the court. Like, oh yeah, I'm an NBA player, but I'm just here, just hooping, and not just use the sports analogy, but it
Yeah, I
applies to
mean,
everything
you
in
can
life,
apply that, let's say like I've noticed, as I've like you like create this archetype for yourself, right? And a lot of times you don't even have to put it into words, but let's say I'm repeating myself, like I'm not even repeating, I just have the belief, I'm an entrepreneur. I've noticed the habit that, recently in the past couple weeks I've been going to bed later and I'm really slipping off this bedtime, and I'm like, okay, who cares, whatever. But I have this like voice in my mind that's like, I'm an entrepreneur, and if I'm not doing something that an entrepreneur is doing, because I'm seeing like I'm not waking up early, I wasn't on my diet, right? That all doesn't apply to the type of person that I've like constructed. So I've really been looking at my own habits. Like I'm not fulfilling this self identity. So what can I do to change this? To get to that point. A lot of times when you have that voice, right? Let's say the entrepreneur. I'm constantly saying I'm an entrepreneur, but then when I go and slip up, right, this isn't what an entrepreneur does, and it sort of cracks the self identity. You can either you can leave it there to die and wither up, or you can actually do something about it and fix it. Hold up, my computer's about to die. I'm gonna just plug it in real quick. But
All right.
yeah,
Yeah, you're lagging a little bit. Is it me or is it?
nah, it's me. Is it fixed now?
Yeah, it's fixed now. It's
Okay.
fixed now.
So yeah, I don't believe, I've created this, this pendulum effect, right? I don't believe in, this fake confidence that people have developed, right? You can't tell somebody to always, you know, be confident and repeat these affirmations, that's not gonna work because there's there's a karmic balance in the universe, right? And a lot of times, you have this high, and just as a pendulum, you swing one way, it's always going to swing the other, complete opposite. And that's why I believe in trying to stay in the neutral state where you're just, positive and you have this belief about yourself, but you're not really trying to force anything or overdo it. And, as these good things come, you're staying in like a grateful state that you can accept them, be appreciative towards them, but not overdo it. And that allows, when these negatives come, you're going to handle them better and they're going to hit you less harder. That's why also, a lot of people, okay, well, what if something great happens to me and I'm trying to have something great happen to me? You know, what can I do to, not be scared? Because I think the number one thing is a lot of times, people get a big high, right? And, when they're developing, this identity surrounding the pendulum effect, they're scared about the opposite swing. Well, I think, when you have faith in the divine, right? Like God, whatever it is for you, you shouldn't fear, the opposite swing, right? You should cuz really when something's like high up here and you swing, right? um sorry. But yeah, so I'm trying to get this clip.
Oh, go on, go on.
But yeah, bro, like I mean, it's really the fact that like, something great happens to you, you're gonna fear, that eventual, subsiding negative. But you have to understand, like, it's everything's here to like help you, right? Negatives are always here to, you're gonna be able to grow from them. And when you don't have fear, right, and you're not, cascading in that sense of fear, you're really gonna have a lot of things attracted to you, whether if they come in forms of positive and negatives, you can ask, or you can you can ask God for something. Like, let's say I want to be a faster runner. God's not gonna just make you run faster. It's gonna give you the shoes that you're gonna be able to run. So that's something you have to take in account when you're trying to reach new levels, and progress yourself. You're not just gonna be given it. You're gonna be given tools to grow, and a lot of times those tools are these negative experiences that will help you grow.
Exactly. And we live in a society, that a lot of times people's successes and people's failures, like they're broadcasted to the world, And let's be honest, people fear that, But that's just such an unhealthy relationship with failure. Nobody should be fearing failure because the only way to learn is through failure, whether that's your own failure or the failure of others. Hopefully, you learn from the failure of others and you can look ahead of time. But you can also learn a lot more from your own failure, and you shouldn't even be looking at it as failure. That's just another experience. That's just a proof that you tried, because you know what the real failure is? Going there your whole life and thinking, man, I should have done this. Man, I could have done this. And then you just never did it because you were too scared to fail, you know? Like, for example, take a look at my guy, Ben Simmons, He was always too scared to fail. He was a great player, won rookie of the year, all of that. And he was going crazy, I ain't gonna lie. But one playoff series, he was just too scared to fail. And he couldn't make a layup over someone that was a whole foot shorter than him because he was scared that he was gonna miss it. Like, what if he just went up with it, missed it anyways? What's the worst that could happen? But he just didn't shoot. He passed it off, and then that just became his whole brand. You know, Rappers out here sneak dissing him, talking about, "Oh, you shoot like Ben Simmons. That's why you ain't making nothing." Now people clown him. People saying that he's got to go to China and stuff. Just all of that, just off the fear of failure. And we see our most talented individuals. You know, they have fear of failure, and look at how it's brought them. And then you have other people who go and embrace failure, embrace the mistakes. You know, who they mess up, they're like, okay, this that happened. Let me just go do it again. You know, and this applies to everything in life. You know, many of the greatest business owners, they had many businesses that failed before the one that succeeded. But no one remembers, oh yeah, this is the one dude that failed 3 times opening up a business, you know? Nah, they remember, oh yeah, this is the one dude who was a billionaire now. And they want to learn from them. And this again, this applies to everything, you know, opening up a business, your studies, uh, getting women, you know, um, just everything in life. It's just embracing failure, you know.
Yeah, and when I'm talking to people, a lot of people who are like seeking advice, they're really living in a sort of anxious state, right? And when I really get to the bottom of it and unpack the layers, a lot of it's just a fear. It's just based in fear, and they're not taking these steps, right? They're not doing what they actually genuinely want to do from fulfill their own desires, is because they're operating in a state of fear. I had this one guy, this one friend who constantly stutters, right? And when we were going, we were talking for like 2 hours, and at the end, he told me like, yeah, really, when I'm having like conversations, a lot of times I'm always just thinking about the worst possible case scenario, like what not to say, or what could obstruct a genuine social conversation. And a lot of times when I notice, there would be social scenes, and then this individual would get heavily like intoxicated, and when he was intoxicated, he started spewing a whole bunch of like racial slurs, hard R N word, and I was caught off guard, and he was like talking to all these girls, something he's never done, and it was pretty, it was a negative experience, right? But I really think it showed, going into a whole nother topic, I really think it, demonstrated, his shadow, right? He has all these repressed desires, and they've just been, going in deep, deep, and he's been like, um, shoving them down in his unconscious, right? And when he's, his inhibition is lowered, and he's able to, really speak from the subconscious, all his desires are piling out. But that's why I say you have to integrate this into your real life. You have to integrate your shadow, because when you're holding deep inside like all these desires, they're gonna spill out, and it's gonna be in an unhealthy way. That's why you have to find healthy ways to integrate your shadow into yourself. And that can only come through looking inward, right? Subconscious work, and really studying psychology. If you don't have a a good therapist, which many people don't, and I wouldn't even recommend going to therapy, when you can like have all these, you can ask yourself these own questions, right? Even AI, right? AI is so powerful now that you can ask ChatGPT like, give me four shadow work prompts, right? And you can answer the prompts, and then you can just go deeper. Even with an AI, right? It's unable to impact, because it's not coming from external source. It's really coming inward, right? And you have all the answers, but you're just not to the point where you're able to answer them, because you're in a state of denial. So if you unpack all these, you're going to be able to learn a lot about yourself, and you're going to be able to operate a lot better, right? You're not going to be this type of person that's quiet for 2 weeks, and then one week, if you ever notice you're like that, one week, you just take all your anger out, right? That's a sign of have a lot of suppressed traits in your shadow.
Of course, yeah, um, people they have kind of this mask of themselves, you know. They go willingly or unwillingly, they go to certain places and they put on a mask. And then of course everyone does this. I've caught myself doing this too, you know, that you go to a certain place, you know, and now just all of a sudden you're quiet, you don't really talk to people, because that's just the mask that you've set yourself up as, and even the other direction, sometimes people they just talk too much because they feel like they have to, they feel like, oh yeah, um I'm like the comedian in the friend group, or I know people just view me as a funny person, so I just gotta force it out, and every day we go at these different scenarios and we put on a different mask. And I feel like that's our job as people to, decipher that and say, okay, how can I make a more holistic version of myself? And to you, I ask, you're talking about shadow exercises and different types of therapy, even therapy alone in this modern age. What do you think the role of self-awareness that can be, you know, exercised through therapy in other ways, but what do you think the role of self-awareness is in making a better version of yourself and evolving?
So I think self awareness is, I'm glad you asked that. I really think it's the key to understanding yourself, right? Because let's say, for example, you're in an argument, right? You're in an argument with a person, and you're going back and forth, and you're spewing, all these, these insults, between each other, right? Understand that whatever if you have that self-awareness where you can see what someone's telling you and what you're reacting, you have this visceral reaction. If you can understand this anger and hatred and these insults you're throwing, that this is really just a reflection of yourself, right? A lot of this, most of it is just a projection. So let's say you catch yourself in an argument, you're projecting and you're saying something, you're calling someone lazy, right? You're really struggling internally with laziness. And let's say they're this is why I don't get into arguments, because let's say someone's arguing with you, right? They can call you fat, for example. And a lot of times, that's something that's valid. You have to work on your physique, but they're also giving up their number one insecurity, is that they're fat, right? And their weight. And because really everything is a projection, right? And you also have to understand, like, when you develop a certain self awareness, and this really comes from meditation and just unlocking that ability to be quiet and just live peacefully in your own thoughts. You can understand that, for example, let's say you're watching something on TV, and something happens. Let's say a character that really produces like a visceral reaction. You find yourself in an extreme state of dislike for this individual. You're gonna be able to say, okay, wait, maybe this is something that I actually struggle with myself. How can I learn about this? How can I learn from my dislike of this character, and apply this to myself, right? Because a lot of times, humans are very self-critical creatures, and I think social media amplifies this. So if you can understand, where this self-hatred comes from, you can start to evolve, because I really think evolution comes from self-love and gratitude, and you can't do that if you're really hating yourself.
Of course, and you made a very valid point with the whole argument bit that when people call out certain flaws or they're always like picky about certain things, that reveals what they value. If they didn't value that, or if they didn't constantly question that in themselves, they wouldn't have brought it up in the first place. Like, just continuing with like the fat example. If someone who's never struggled with their weight, or their body composition, and never really had to think about that in themselves, they wouldn't even really use that. They wouldn't even point it out in another person. Maybe they just make the observation, but they wouldn't really try and use that to hurt somebody because they don't really know that it hurts. Like they haven't really experienced that themselves. But when people are trying to use tools, in verbal discussions in order to hurt somebody and try and get them where it stings, this really reveals more about them and how they think and how their perspective has been built. So, we catch ourselves doing that sometimes, and we really got to be introspective.
Yeah,
But
no.
how can we go ahead and build this self-awareness? How can we say, okay, this is me, this is who I am, even in a critical lens?
Yeah, well, I think there's two steps, right? And the number one step took in order to transform myself from being someone who was very, socially anxious, right? I had a lot of uncontrollable negative thoughts. And one thing I really did is I started at the base, right? Which was just mindfulness. So I did meditation. And the reason I stress meditation so much, a lot of people, it can be uncomfortable, even for myself now. I'm not fully, back into the flow of meditation, but I still utilize it, on my day to days when I really need it. But meditation really gives you the ability to, sit with these thoughts, right? And sit in the uncomfortableness, right? And another thing that I think is really important about meditation that ties into what you just asked me was when you're meditating, right? You a lot of different thoughts bubble up, right? And this can be from your subconscious or just mental clutter that you get from external triggers like social media and all that. All these thoughts bubble up, right? And it's your job to dismiss these thoughts in a healthy way and then go back to focusing on your breathing. So I think the ability for you to dismiss these thoughts really tie into the ability for you to actually notice them. And when you're noticing these thoughts, which a lot of people don't have, or just actions, you're developing that skill of self awareness. And another step is, thinking, right? How are you thinking? Are you a positive or negative thinker? Positive thinkers are going to be able to shape their whole reality, how they view reality just on, their the lens that they're using to look at reality. So if you're looking at something from a positive reality, you're going to be able to see, okay, maybe this person blah blah blah, maybe it's just, a projection, or maybe yeah, okay, maybe they're right. How can I, work on this in myself and understand where they're actually faulting, right? Or even I think you can even take it as far as like, different experiences happen and sometimes you're going to miss the meaning if you're thinking negatively. A lot of times, if even if you're not being neutral, right? Being positive, you're going to be able to see, two different sides, because a lot of times, yeah, we're genetically, designed to see, the negatives and where we can, find at fault so where we can avoid, right? So if you're able to think negatively and then understand, use that mindfulness skill that you've developed from meditation to say, okay, hold up, I'm noticing that this negative thought has occurred. You're able to transition into a positive lens and you're able to get two sides of a story. You're able to get two different sides of a perspective and experience this, something that's happening.
course. And people just need to view it from a sense of looking at themselves from a third perspective, you know, detaching themselves from their thoughts. And a mantra that you could repeat to yourself is, I am not my thoughts. And if you dig deeper on that, many people, they believe that themselves, like who they are is their conscious, their internal dialogue. That's me. That's me talking. But what if this wasn't the case? Uh,
Yeah, I mean,
what if your own self, it was something greater than just your observations, internal and external? And that's why you should challenge yourself to, again, just detach yourself from your thoughts and be able to see, okay, this is me, this is my thoughts, this is what's going on in the world, this is what's going on in the world that's outside of my control, and then this is me again, and be able to just observe it. I feel like people really need to tap into that.
yeah, I think you bring up a great point, all these different, lenses, right? And I think, the root of that is, again, like meditation and mindfulness. I think there's actually a distinct difference from people who practice mindfulness from people who don't. I think they're actually two completely different people, because, when you're able to be mindful, right? Things and experiences, you're able to, see it through a lens of the observer, right? You can observe your reality and you don't have to, get interacted, by your emotions. You can just observe them, right? And then that also translates, as you said, just observe your thoughts. You are not your thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, that might be a great place to end it. That was
Yeah.
episode 3. We covered a lot.
A lot. You know, Tap in with more questions.
Of course,
Uh,
bro. Leave the questions in the
yeah.
comments.
Yeah, and everybody that's clipping on TikTok, all these like
Yeah.
accounts popping up everywhere, you know,
We appreciate you
they,
guys, man.
yeah, you know,
That steak deal,
keep,
that's
yeah,
really,
pretty huge.
yeah. But yeah,
Yeah.
man. All right, let me end this recording.